The most dangerous outcome here may not be war. It may be no deal. That sounds less dramatic, which is exactly why it is so easy to underestimate. War is loud. War gives you explosions, escalation ladders, visible thresholds, urgent headlines. No deal sounds quieter. It sounds like delay, drift, the kind of gray zone mess governments muddle through all the time. But this file points to something much darker. The real danger may be that the United States and Iran do not return to full-scale war, but also do not strike any real settlement. Instead, they stumble into a new status quo. No agreement, no sanctions relief. No durable ceasefire architecture, no full peace, no full war, just an unresolved pressure system in which Iran still controls the Strait of Hormuz. The United States keeps some degree of maritime pressure alive. Israel keeps looking for ways to sabotage any normalization. And the entire region lives inside a crisis that appears calmer than war while preserving most of the machinery needed for the next war. That is the master axis. Not breakthrough or breakdown, a trapped middle. And once you see that, everything in the file starts pointing toward it. The difficulty of the talks, the cargo ship seizure, the humiliation cycle. The insistence from Tehran that sanctions relief is essential. The argument that Trump has already gotten what he wants by getting out of the war. The warning that Israel may fight much harder against a deal than against a pause in bombing. All of it points toward the same structural danger. A no-deal equilibrium. This matters because most people still think about diplomacy in binary terms. Either there is a deal or there is war. But the file makes clear that the most likely outcome may be neither. Parsi's own probability breakdown is blunt. A 25% chance of a deal, a 5% chance of full-scale war, a 70% chance of a walkout, and a new non-negotiated status quo. That number should change how people read the whole crisis, because a 70% outcome is not background. It is the main event. And that means the real question is no longer, can war be avoided? The real question is, what kind of system emerges if war is avoided but no deal is reached? That is where the story becomes much more serious. Start with Iran. Iran needs sanctions relief, not symbolically, not eventually, practically, urgently. That is one of the hardest truths in the file. Hormuz gives Iran leverage. Yes, control of the strait. Gives Tehran bargaining power. Yes. But bargaining power is not reconstruction. It is not investment. It is not industrial recovery. It is not long-term economic stabilization, revenue connected to the strait. Does not substitute for reintegration into a wider economic system. The country cannot rebuild itself on maritime leverage alone. That means the absence of a deal is not neutral for Iran. It leaves Tehran in a position where it still has tactical leverage, but not the strategic relief it actually needs. And yet Trump may still prefer that outcome. Why? Because Trump has already secured his narrowest core objective. He got out of the war. If the United States does not go back into large-scale bombing and no deal is reached, he can still tell a story in which he avoided another major military entanglement. He can walk away from the battlefield without walking into a politically expensive settlement. That is the asymmetry. Iran needs a deal more than Trump does. Trump can live without one. That does not mean it is the best outcome for him. It means it is the easiest one, and the easiest path in politics often defeats the best one. That is where Israel enters the story. This is one of the most important structural points in the entire file. A real deal with Iran would likely require sanctions relief. That is the key. And sanctions relief is exactly what Israel most fears. War damages Iran quickly. Sanctions damage Iran slowly. Both serve the same basic Israeli interest of weakening Iran's economy, industry, and long-term strategic capacity. A real deal interrupts that process. A real deal means Iran starts to breathe again. It starts to rebuild. It starts to attract investment. It starts to recover. That is why Parsi argues that Israel may oppose a sanctions lifting deal much more aggressively than it opposes a U.S. pause in active bombing. From Israel's perspective, a no-deal status quo keeps the core mechanism of pressure alive. A deal with sanctions relief threatens to unwind it. That creates Trump's real strategic dilemma. He can make a deal and take a large political fight with Israel and its allies. He can avoid that fight by walking away from a real deal while still staying out of full-scale war. Or he can continue managing appearances, exaggerating progress, humiliating the Iranians, floating optimism, and preparing the blame narrative he can use if things collapse. That last path may be politically irresistible for him. And that is why the no-deal scenario becomes so plausible. It allows Trump to avoid a larger war, avoid a larger domestic fight, avoid giving Iran what it most needs, and still say that he tried. That is not grand strategy, that is political convenience, but politically convenient outcomes can still be strategically dangerous. And that is exactly what the no-deal status quo would be, because in that world, the war is not solved. It is preserved in a quieter form. Iran still holds Hormuz. The United States still has incentives to maintain a naval or maritime pressure posture. Sanctions still remain. Israel still has every incentive to intensify sabotage, covert action, and pressure against any drift toward normalization. And each new provocation, every ship seizure, every humiliating move, every Israeli action, every misread signal around the strait becomes a possible trigger for re-escalation. That is not peace. That is stored conflict. And stored conflict is dangerous because it encourages everyone to misread the quiet as stability. It is not stability, it is unresolved structure. That is why the file S discussion of Lebanon matters so much too. Parsi says Iran. S pressure in favor of a Lebanon ceasefire was partly a test of Trump. Can he restrain Israel? Can he actually stop another front from being reignited? Can he prove that a deal with Washington means something if Israel wants the war back? That test matters because Tehran is not negotiating only over sanctions or enrichment. It is negotiating over whether the American president can actually deliver the strategic environment he promises. If Trump cannot restrain Israel, then any agreement with him becomes less valuable from Tehran's perspective. That means the no-deal scenario grows even more likely. Because now the issue is not only whether Trump wants to pay the domestic price of making a deal, it is whether Tehran believes that a deal with him would hold even if Israel wants it broken. That is another reason the middle outcome is so sticky. It requires less trust than a deal, less political courage than a deal, less strategic clarity than a deal. And it still lets all sides preserve some of what they care about. Trump preserves freedom from a renewed war and avoids a major pro. Israel backlash, Iran preserves control over the strait and avoids outright capitulation, even though it does not get sanctions relief. Israel preserves the sanctions regime and continues the slow degradation of Iranian capacity without having to carry the full cost of a US-Iran war. That is why the middle outcome is so dangerous. Everyone can live with it just enough to keep it alive. And because everyone can live with it just enough, no one solves the underlying contradictions. Now bring Hormuz back into focus because Hormuz is what turns this from a diplomatic failure into a global systemic risk. 1/5 of the world, S-oil and LNG passes through that strait. If the no-deal status quo hardens, then every new episode of maritime pressure sits inside a corridor whose instability feeds directly into energy costs, shipping risk, insurance prices, freight routes, inflation, and political stress far beyond the region. That means the no-deal scenario is not merely a US-Iran problem. It is a global cost distribution problem, and once outside actors start carrying more of those costs, they stop remaining passive observers. That is where China matters. That is where the Gulf states matter. That is where every government dependent on stable energy prices matters. The no-deal status quo may look quieter than war, but it keeps the pain architecture alive in a way that can spill outward again and again. That is why the cargo ship seizure matters too. It is not only an insult, it is a preview of the kind of low-grade coercive contest that could define the next phase if no deal emerges. Not full-scale war, but enough pressure to keep the structure alive, enough friction to keep shipping uncertain, enough humiliation to keep diplomacy brittle, enough unresolved force to keep the future dangerous. That is the larger judgment. The real reason Trump-Iran talks may be falling apart is not simply that the issues are hard or that the personalities are volatile. It is that the easiest political outcome for the key players may be a non-solution. And that non-solution is exactly the one that preserves the architecture of the next crisis. That is why the no-deal scenario is more dangerous than it first appears. It does not solve the war. It stores the war, it stores it in sanctions, stores it in Hormuz, stores it in Israeli sabotage incentives, stores it in unresolved humiliation, stores it in an unfinished negotiation everyone can later blame on someone else. And once a conflict is stored like that, it does not need to be rebuilt from scratch. It is already there, waiting. That is why the future ahead may not be peace, Not renewed full war, but something colder, quieter, and in some ways more unstable. A suspended conflict in which everyone says the worst was avoided while the machinery of the next confrontation remains fully assembled underneath the pause.